Hi everyone! Today we are going to be talking about two punctuation marks, the colon and the semicolon. So please make sure as we're going through this video that you have your piece of Cornell note paper out and that you're taking notes as we go, because that is what I will check to make sure that you've gone through the video. And that's also going to be a great study resource for you as we continue to talk about these punctuation marks for the rest of the year. Also, just know that, one of the advantages of listening to this video is that you can pause the video if you need more time to write. You can go back and rewind if you need to go over an example again. So please don't feel that you have to just watch the video straight through, and just make sure that you're taking good notes for yourself. So on our Cornell notes, we're going to start filling out our topic and objective, which is colons and semicolons for today. And the essential questions that we're going to try to be answering today are what a colon is used for in writing and what a semicolon is used for in writing. So take a moment to jot that down. And as you're writing that, I want to remind you how we set up our Cornell notes. This example that I'm about to show you is from our subject-verb agreements grammar unit, so you do not need to write this down. But I just want to show you, remember that our questions and main ideas go in the left column, and typically our more detailed notes or in grammar examples, our examples go in the right column. So rule in the left, example on the right. That's probably the easiest way to set it up. So once you've copied down our topic and essential question, we're going to get started with the colon. And that's what a colon looks like. So a colon has two major uses in the middles of sentences. And if I were you, I would maybe write these rules or uses in the left column and space them out so you can write some examples in the right column. The first use, and that's what we'll go over first, is to introduce a list. And what we'll be going over a little bit after that is when a colon comes between two independent clauses, when the second clause explains or summarizes the first. So take a moment to jot that down. When you're done, we're going to talk about the first use of a colon to introduce a list. And so on this slide, I have just a few examples for you. I have another example after this for you to write down, but I think this slide shows a good example and also a poor example of colon usage with a list. So notice in the first example, it says, Greg took 4 items from the box: a watch, a ring, a crown, and a Kit Kat bar. So the first part, Greg took 4 items from the box, is a complete thought. We call that an independent clause, which we went over last week, and that could stand on its own if we wanted it to. So that's a good use of the colon because the list is coming after this, and this is the complete thought. There's the colon in the middle. Down here we have an incorrect example of colon usage where it says, my favorite fruits are apples, oranges, and bananas. This person has put the colon right there, but notice my favorite fruits are is not a complete thought. It's not an independent clause. That could not stand on its own. So we would not want to put the colon right there. Instead, this would just be a single complete thought. So just because you have a list doesn't mean that you have to use a colon. It's only when the colon is introducing that list and coming after the complete thought. So here's another example. Mrs. Skoglunds made 3 dishes for the potluck: lasagna, deviled eggs, and salad. Notice we have a complete thought here. Mrs. Skoglund made 3 dishes for the potluck. That could be, or it is an independent clause. It could stand on its own, but we're going to use that colon to introduce the list of what I supposedly brought. The second major use of a colon is when there are 2 complete thoughts, so 2 independent clauses, but the second one is an explanation or a summary of the first clause. So for example, they said, this is my point. If we buy Judy a plane, she might take us for a ride. So notice both of those could stand on their own, but the second one is explaining the first. The first says, this is my point, and the second says what the point is. Here's another example. that you might see, something like, here is my thought, we need to carry in the furniture before it starts raining. So again, both independent clauses, but this second part is saying what your thought supposedly is. One thing to remember, and hopefully you've picked up on this, but we don't want to place a colon in the middle of a complete thought ever. So something like, Max made a sandwich with peanut butter, bananas, and jelly. Remember, just because we have a list doesn't mean you need a colon. So just a reminder, I see that mistake a lot. So make sure that there has to be that independent clause first in either usage of a colon. Another example, if you wanted to jot that down, make sure that your colon notes are in order, because then we're going to move on to the semicolon. And that's what the semicolon looks like. So there are actually 3 major uses in the middles of sentences for a semicolon. And we'll talk about each of these individually, but again, it would probably be a good idea to write these in the left column of your notes and to kind of space them out so you have some room for examples in the right column. So the first use is to separate 2 independent clauses when they are of similar or equal importance and are related thoughts. The second use is to separate 2 independent clauses when the second has a transition word to begin it, like however, still an independent clause on the other side, but some people get tripped up by that transition word. And third, you can use semicolons when commas are already frequently used in a list, and I'll show you examples of all of these here in just a second. So jot those down. And we're going to talk about the first and the most common use of a semicolon to join 2 related and complete thoughts. This is probably one of the most common punctuation mistakes I see, so it's really important that you notice how to use the semicolon correctly here. So for example, if we say, Toby felt tired, he decided to play soccer with his friends anyway. If we broke those apart, those are both complete or independent clauses. They could stand on their own if we had to. We do not want to put a comma there. A comma is not strong enough to separate independent clauses. That's why we need the semicolon. It's okay to use the semicolon here because the 2 clauses are related. The subject is similar. It's probably better to use a semicolon and not a colon because it's not introducing a list, and this second point doesn't necessarily explain the first, they're just kind of related. So that's how you can kind of tell the difference. Another example, the blue sneakers were my favorite, could stand on its own. They were also the most expensive in the store. Again, could stand on its own as an independent clause. So because they are sort of connected about the blue sneakers, we're going to put a semicolon in the middle. Again, we wouldn't use a colon because it's not introducing a list, and this second one is related to the first, but it's not necessarily like summarizing or explaining or clarifying it. The second use of a colon is very similar to the first use. Just sometimes we have a transition word. It's called a conjunctive adverb, but really just a transition word in the middle of a sentence, and so sometimes that trips people up. So for example, if someone said, Mark really likes bananas. However, he's not in the mood for one now. Mark likes bananas, could stand on its own. He's not in the mood for one now, could stand on its own. Sometimes people get tripped up by this transition word, and you can see a list of, Northink calls them themos, but you can just think of them as transition words down here. Notice we do actually have 2 punctuation marks going on here, and that's why it's important for everybody to remember this. Not only do we have the semicolon separating the 2 independent clauses, we also have the comma separating this transition and this pause. So you do want to make sure to kind of watch out for some of these words, because if you see them like this in the middle of a sentence between 2 independent clauses, you'll need a semicolon and a comma. So I would maybe jot down a few of those, however, in addition, also, those common ones you might see. Another example, I had just started looking over the menu, could stand on its own. Meanwhile, my husband had already finished his baked potato. also could stand on its own, but they are related, so it is okay to put the semicolon. We have this sort of transition word, meanwhile, so we put the comma after that. The final use of a semicolon is actually not very common, but you will sometimes see it when you have a list that already has a lot of commas. Semicolons are that stronger punctuation that separate items further. So here's my example for you, and again, this is on number 3. It says Mrs. Skoglund has lived in Overland Park, Kansas, Olathe, Kansas, and Pittsburgh, Kansas. So notice that we have commas already separating city to state. So Overland Park, comma, Kansas, Olathe, comma, Kansas, etc. So instead of just putting a comma between all of the cities that I've lived in, that could get kind of confusing because that's a lot of commas. So to separate and to show that Overland Park, Kansas is one group, Olathe, Kansas is one group, and Pittsburgh, Kansas is one group, we could put a semicolon there. Again, you don't see that a lot, and it's really mostly with cities to states, but I just wanted to show you guys that there is another use of a semicolon that you might see sometimes. The last thing we're going to do, and I will be looking for this on your Cornell notes when I grade them on Monday, are 6 practice problems. And they are just going over exactly what we've talked about. So colons and semicolons. Remember, there are 2 uses of a colon: to introduce a list after a complete thought, and when there are 2 independent clauses and the second explains or summarizes the first. And it's also going over the 3 uses of semicolons. So first, to separate 2 independent clauses when they are kind of related to each other. The second, to separate 2 independent and related clauses also when there's that transition word. Don't be tripped up by that. And third, when we have a list, typically like cities and states, that already has a lot of commas and we want to show further separation, we can use semicolons. So on the 6 practice problems, you do not need to write the whole sentence, but I do want you to indicate the number. You could write no change if it's already correct, or you may need to change the punctuation mark to a colon, to a semicolon, take it out altogether. You just need to, using your notes, see what works for that particular sentence. So semicolons and colons, your notes are due on Monday.